What's up everyone? Welcome back to the channel. Tonight I've got 3 stories for you about people who thought they'd found their dream homes, only to discover they'd moved into their worst nightmare. There's something about buying a new place that makes you feel invincible, like you're finally in control of your own space. But as tonight's stories prove, sometimes the house has other plans. Before we dive in, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe if you're new here. It helps me keep making content like this. And trust me, you don't want to miss what's coming up. Let's get started. This first story comes from a guy named David who bought a house in Riverside, California back in 2019. David was 31, worked as an accountant, and had been saving up for years to buy his first place. The house was a 1970s ranch-style home in a quiet residential area, nothing fancy, but it was his. The previous owner was an elderly woman named Mrs. Chun who'd lived there for over 40 years. According to the realtor, she'd moved into assisted living after her health started declining. The sale went smoothly, no issues with inspection, and David got the keys on a Friday afternoon in March. David spent his first weekend painting the living room and setting up his furniture. The house had good bones, hardwood floors, big windows, a decent-sized backyard. Mrs. Chun had kept it in excellent condition, though some of the wallpaper was pretty dated. On Sunday night, David was watching TV when he heard a car door slam in his driveway. He looked out the front window and saw an older Asian woman walking up to his front door with a set of keys in her hand. It was Mrs. Chun. David opened the door before she could use her keys. She looked surprised to see him, like she'd forgotten he existed. "Oh," she said, blinking slowly. "You're the new person." "Hi, Mrs. Chun," David said. "Is everything okay? Did you forget something?" She stared at him for a long moment, then looked past him into the house. "I just wanted to check on things, make sure everything was in order." David felt awkward but didn't want to be rude. "Would you like to come in and look around?" Mrs. Chun walked through the house slowly, touching the walls and checking the windows. She spent several minutes in the master bedroom, opening and closing the closet door. "The lock sticks sometimes," she told David. "You have to pull the handle up while you turn the key." She left after about 20 minutes, taking her keys with her. David figured it was hard for her to let go of a place she'd lived for so long and didn't think much of it. But she came back the next week. Same routine, drove up, let herself in like she still lived there. This time David wasn't home, and he only knew about it because his neighbor mentioned seeing Mrs. Chen's car in the driveway. David called the realtor, who said she'd talked to Mrs. Chen about returning the keys, but the visits continued. Sometimes David would come home from work to find evidence that someone had been there. Lights turned on in rooms he hadn't used, the thermostat adjusted, his coffee pot moved to a different spot on the counter. The breaking point came on a Thursday night in April. David woke up around 2 a.m. to the sound of someone moving around his kitchen. He grabbed a baseball bat and crept downstairs, expecting to find a burglar. Instead, he found Mrs. Chun standing at his stove, cooking something that smelled like fish and vegetables. She was wearing a bathrobe and slippers, and her gray hair was in curlers like she'd been getting ready for bed. "Mrs. Chun," David said, trying to keep his voice calm. "What are you doing here?" She turned around slowly, holding a wooden spoon. "Making dinner," she said matter-of-factly. "Harold gets cranky when he's hungry." David didn't know who Harold was, but he was pretty sure Mrs. Chun was having some kind of episode. "Mrs. Chun, this isn't your house anymore. You sold it to me. Remember?" She looked around the kitchen like she was seeing it for the first time. "This is my house," she said firmly. "I've lived here for 43 years. Harold and I raised our children here." David spent the next hour trying to convince Mrs. Chun to let him drive her home. She eventually agreed, but seemed confused about how she'd gotten to his house in the first place. The next day, David contacted Mrs. Chen's family through the assisted living facility. Her daughter explained that Mrs. Chun had been diagnosed with dementia and sometimes became disoriented about where she lived. She apologized and promised to make sure her mother didn't have access to the keys anymore. But the visits didn't stop. Mrs. Chun would show up at random times, sometimes trying to garden in the backyard, sometimes just sitting on the front porch like she was waiting for someone. David started having to lock his doors during the day, something he'd never had to do before. The situation finally resolved itself when Mrs. Chen's family moved her to a memory care facility 2 hours away. David changed all the locks and installed a security system, but he never quite felt comfortable in that house again. He sold it 8 months later. If these stories are keeping you on the edge of your seat, go ahead and smash that like button. It really helps the channel grow. Now let's move on to story number 2. This next story happened to a couple named Mike and Jennifer who bought a house in Syracuse, New York. Mike was a teacher, Jennifer worked at a bank, and they'd been married for about 3 years when they decided to buy their first home together. The house was a 2-story colonial built in the 1950s, located in an established neighborhood with tree-lined streets and sidewalks. It needed some cosmetic work but was structurally sound and within their budget. The basement was unfinished but dry, perfect for storage and maybe a workshop down the line. Mike and Jennifer moved in during the summer and spent their first few weeks unpacking and getting settled. The house felt comfortable, like it had been waiting for them. Even their cat, Smokey, seemed to love the new place. About a month after moving in, Jennifer started noticing small things that didn't make sense. Food would go missing from their pantry, not entire items but portions. A can of soup would be opened and half empty. A loaf of bread would have several slices missing. Mike thought Jennifer was just forgetting what she'd eaten, and Jennifer thought Mike was snacking more than usual. Then they started finding dirty dishes in the sink that neither of them remembered using. Always the same items: a bowl, a spoon, and a coffee mug. Always washed clean but left to dry. Mike suggested they might have mice, but there were no droppings or other signs of rodents. Plus, mice don't wash dishes. The mystery got stranger in September. Jennifer was doing laundry in the basement when she noticed that one of Mike's old t-shirts was missing from the pile. She looked around the basement but couldn't find it anywhere. 2 days later, the shirt appeared in their regular laundry hamper, dirty and smelling like cigarette smoke. Neither Mike nor Jennifer smoked. They started paying closer attention to their belongings. Items would disappear for a few days, then return to different locations. A book from their coffee table would show up on the kitchen counter. Mike's reading glasses would vanish from the bedroom and reappear in the bathroom medicine cabinet. The situation escalated in early October. Mike was working late one evening when Jennifer called him at school, whispering into the phone. "Someone's in the basement," she said. "I can hear them moving around down there." Mike told her to leave the house immediately and call the police. Jennifer grabbed Smokey and waited in her car until Mike and the officers arrived. The police searched the entire house, including the basement, but found no signs of forced entry or intruders. Everything looked normal. They told Jennifer it was probably just the old house settling or maybe a small animal that had gotten inside. But Jennifer knew what she'd heard. Footsteps. Definitely footsteps. Mike decided to set up a motion-activated camera in the basement, just to put Jennifer's mind at ease. He positioned it to cover the main area and the stairs. The first few nights, the camera picked up nothing unusual. Then, on a Wednesday night, it recorded something that made both Mike and Jennifer question their sanity. The footage showed a man coming up from what looked like behind the furnace, where there was just a concrete wall. He was maybe 40 years old, thin, with shoulder-length brown hair and a beard. He was wearing Mike's missing t-shirt and a pair of jeans that were too short for his legs. The man moved through the basement like he'd been there many times before. He knew exactly where Mike kept his tools, where Jennifer stored their holiday decorations, even where they kept the extra toilet paper. He spent about an hour down there, just walking around and touching their things. Near the end of the footage, the man pulled out a small notebook and wrote something down, then returned to wherever he'd come from behind the furnace. Mike and Jennifer watched the video 3 times before calling the police. This time, the officers took them seriously. They brought flashlights and spent over an hour examining every inch of the basement. What they found changed everything. Behind the furnace, hidden by shadows and careful positioning, was a small opening in the foundation wall. It led to a crawl space that connected to the storm drain system under the street. Someone had been using it as a way to get in and out of their house without being detected. The crawl space contained a sleeping bag, several changes of clothes, canned food, and dozens of notebooks filled with detailed observations about Mike and Jennifer's daily routines. The man had been living under their house for months, possibly since before they'd moved in. Police set up surveillance and caught the man 2 nights later. His name was Robert Marsh, and he'd been homeless for several years. He'd discovered the opening while looking for shelter and had been using various basements in the neighborhood as temporary homes. Mike and Jennifer had the opening sealed with concrete, but they never felt safe in that house again. They moved out before Christmas. Alright, before we get to the final story, don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. I post new horror content every week, and hitting that subscribe button makes sure you never miss an upload. This last story comes from a woman named Rachel who bought a house in Burlington, Vermont. Rachel was a freelance graphic designer in her late 20s who'd been living in apartments for years. She wanted something with character, maybe an older house with some history. She found exactly what she was looking for. A Victorian home built in 1890, complete with original hardwood floors, stained glass windows, and all the quirky details that come with a house that's over a century old. The realtor mentioned that it had been on the market for a while because most buyers wanted newer construction, but Rachel fell in love with it immediately. The house was 3 stories with a finished attic that Rachel planned to use as her home office. The layout was typical for a Victorian, lots of small rooms, narrow hallways, and unexpected corners. Rachel spent her first week just exploring, finding hidden closets and discovering how all the rooms connected. On her second Thursday in the house, Rachel was measuring the upstairs hallway for a runner when she noticed something odd. According to her measurements, there was about 4 feet of space that didn't account for any room. She checked her floor plan, but the numbers didn't add up. Rachel walked the hallway again, counting off the doorways. Master bedroom, guest bedroom, bathroom, linen closet. But based on the exterior dimensions of the house, there should have been another room somewhere. That weekend, Rachel's brother Tom came over to help her hang some pictures. Tom was a contractor, and Rachel asked him to look at the hallway situation. "You're right," Tom said after taking his own measurements. "There's definitely space missing. Could be just thick walls, or maybe they closed off a room at some point." Tom tapped along the wall between the guest bedroom and the linen closet. "This sounds hollow," he said. "Want me to cut a small hole and see what's back there?" Rachel wasn't sure about cutting into the walls of her new house, but her curiosity won out. Tom used a small saw to cut a 6-inch square in the drywall. Behind it was another wall, older plaster and lath construction that probably dated to the original house. But there was definitely empty space beyond that. "There's a room back there," Tom said, shining a flashlight through the hole. "I can see part of a window." They spent the next hour carefully removing more drywall until they had an opening big enough to climb through. What they found was a completely intact bedroom that had been sealed off from the rest of the house. The room was maybe 10 by 12 feet, with a single window that looked out over the backyard. It contained a bed with an iron frame, a small dresser, and a wooden chair. Everything was covered in dust but otherwise in perfect condition, like someone had just walked out and closed the door behind them. "This is incredible," Rachel said. "It's like a time capsule." The strangest part was that the room showed no signs of being abandoned. The bed was made. There were clothes folded neatly in the dresser drawers, and a book sat open on the nightstand as if someone had just been reading it. Tom thought they should contact a local historian or maybe the previous owners to find out why the room had been sealed. But Rachel was fascinated by the discovery and wanted to restore the room to its original condition. She spent the next few days cleaning and organizing the space. The clothes in the dresser were women's clothing from what looked like the 1940s or 1950s dresses, blouses, and undergarments that were old-fashioned but well-preserved. The book on the nightstand was a romance novel published in 1953. Rachel found more personal items as she cleaned. Letters tied with ribbon, photographs of a young woman with dark hair, and a diary with entries dating from 1952 to 1954. The diary belonged to someone named Margaret Collins, and from reading the entries, Rachel gathered that Margaret had lived in this room as a boarder. The diary entries started normally Margaret writing about her job at a local department store, her hopes of getting married, complaints about the weather. But as Rachel read further, the entries became more troubling. Margaret wrote about hearing voices in the walls, about feeling like someone was watching her sleep, about objects in her room moving when she wasn't there. The final entry was dated October 15, 1954. They're getting louder. I can't stay here anymore. I'm going to pack my things and leave in the morning. But Margaret's things were still there, exactly as she'd left them. Rachel contacted the local historical society and learned that the house had indeed been a boarding house in the 1950s. Margaret Collins had been reported missing in October 1954, but police assumed she'd simply left town. Her room had been sealed off sometime in the 1960s when the house was converted back to a single-family home. Rachel tried to treat the discovery as a fascinating piece of local history, but living in the house became increasingly uncomfortable. Now that she knew about Margaret's room, she started noticing sounds coming from inside the walls: footsteps, muffled voices, what sounded like crying late at night. The breaking point came when Rachel woke up one morning to find Margaret's diary open on her kitchen table. She was certain she'd left it in the sealed room the night before. Rachel moved out 2 weeks later and put the house back on the market. She never found out what happened to Margaret Collins, but she left the room exactly as she'd found it. The house is still for sale. That's all for tonight. Let me know in the comments which story gave you the most chills, and if you want to see more content like this, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe. I'll catch you in the next one.